I'd done some work at a house, a while back, one of those old Georgian-style brick homes. I'm sure you've seen the type. They were popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a big fancy rectangle. Creepy, like old houses tend to be, but not overly so. Anyways, this home was owned by an elderly woman named Eloise Chevalier. She's old money. She had it all her life. Left wealth and married into more wealth. Her husband died about 20 years ago from what can pretty much be summed up as old age. And Eloise ain't much younger than him either. Eloise can't straighten her back past 5 feet, tall and barely manages to hobble around with her wooden cane. She wears this thing called a snood, which functions something like a sack that holds the back of her hair. I guess it was fashionable 100 years ago. She flaunts her wealth by layering herself in posh old clothes and jewelry, always looking like she's about to go somewhere important. She doesn't live alone in that big old house, of course. She's past the age of being able to take care of herself, not that she ever truly did. She has a fella named Charles who lives with her. He's an older black man, younger than her, but gray and tired all the same. His family has been with hers for generations. Back in the day, his folks didn't have much say in the matter, but I guess when all was said and done, they decided to stick around. Charles is the friendly face you turn to after getting an earful from Eloise. She's a mean old crone, and he's the gentle voice of reason. Now, Miss Eloise, he'd say, don't yell at the boy for doing his job. She'll listen to him too. She won't apologize, that would be asking too much, but she'll tap on down the hall with her cane and leave you be. That is until something else gets her riled up. I was there because several days prior, they'd had a break-in. There's a lot of valuable stuff in that house, so Charles contacted me about putting a security system in. Miss Eloise thought I was security enough, he said, but I ain't young anymore. I can't be doing all that. I told him that I felt they'd made the right decision. You get to a point where you can no longer fend for yourself, it's time to get an alarm. And get one even if you can, although I'm biased. Eloise was a special client. She had a large house, and I knew it would be a high-paying job. I walked with Charles around the property, drawing up plans and cost estimates and determining how heavy the antique furniture was that I'd have to move to get to certain corners, testing windows to see if they lifted, knocking on walls to get an idea of where to drill. Once I had a plan, I sat down at a large dining room table that probably hadn't seen too many guests in the past 2 decades, and went over it with Eloise and Charles. My hands started to sweat a little when we got to the cost. I knew the old lady could afford it, but you know how people like her can be, pinching pennies they'll never spend. What about the crawl space store? She asked, her voice sounding weak and crackly, as is often the case in women her age. I paused a moment. Crawl space? I asked. It wasn't that I hadn't noticed she had one. Most houses around here do. It's just that there usually ain't anything in a crawl space except pipes, wires, and dirt. You want sensors on that door too. Eloise cocked her head. Well, of course. I shrugged. Okay. More money for me, I thought. I scribbled an extra $120 onto the quote. I showed them the total, and to my surprise, Eloise agreed. Great, I said with a satisfied smile. I'll start first thing tomorrow morning. Charles escorted me to the front door and extended his long arm and gave me a warm handshake. Okay, young man. I'll look for you in the morning. I nodded politely and headed down the brick steps and towards my truck. Charles had already gone back inside and shut the door behind him when I figured I'd take a quick look at that crawl space door. As the name implies, it's a low space that you can only maneuver through by crawling. This one was no different. It had a small door about waist high. I found it odd, however, that they'd locked it with a deadbolt, the sort of lock you'd see on a regular, exterior door. Most times, people have a simple barrel bolt to keep the crawlspace door shut, and if they're concerned enough, maybe a padlock. But a deadbolt. I chalked it up to silly old person paranoia and headed home for the day. I'd brought my brother, Josh, along the following day. My company is pretty small, tiny, actually. Until recently, it was just me. I'd make the sales, order the supplies, do the installs, and run the service calls. I took Josh on after he got out of prison. He'd fallen on some tough times prior and developed a nasty drug habit, which ultimately led to him committing more crimes to fuel that habit. He was sick. But he got better. Keeping him busy helped. This place always creeped me out, Josh said as we pulled into the driveway. Wait until you see inside. I ain't been in too many old mansions in my life, but of the few I have, they've been occupied by old people with old taste. On the one hand, stepping into a house full of antiques is like going back in time, which can be neat, but on the other hand, the combination of creaky floors, dim lights, and centuries-old portraits with eyes that follow you around the room can create an uneasy feeling. Good morning, Charles greeted us at the front door with a friendly smile. Can I get y'all some coffee? I held up a warm styrofoam cup. My first stop each day. He smiled and looked to Josh, who politely declined. Well, I'll leave you boys to it then, Charles said. We headed indoors so I could show Josh what I had planned. There's a walk-in closet beneath the stairs, where I decided the alarm panel would go. From there, we'd fish wires through the wall and run them through the crawlspace. That way, we could connect the devices to the panel without exposing any wires. Going into a crawlspace can be dirty work, and it requires a certain degree of flexibility. It's best suited for those who are thin and don't suffer from claustrophobia. Josh and I both fit that description, but I'd sent him into a lot of crawl spaces lately and figured I'd give him a break this time. I tracked down Charles, who was in the back garden watering carnations and thistles. Sorry to bother you, Charles, but would you mind unlocking that crawl space door? No bother, he said kindly. You just need to work on the door, right? No, sir. I need to run the wires for all of the first floor devices down there. Charles paused for a moment, and then said, oh. Well, I don't think Miss Eloise will like that. This was a problem I wish I'd known beforehand. If I couldn't run wires through the crawlspace, that would make the job heaps more complicated, and I probably wouldn't have any choice but to leave some of the wires exposed. It'll be real tidy, I said. I'll secure the wires to the joists. You won't even see them. Charles shook his head. I know, but how about I go talk to her right quick? I told him I'd appreciate that and hurried back inside to catch Josh. Don't drill nothing yet, I said. Why? He asked as he was arranging the supplies he needed. Apparently, Mrs. Chevalier won't be happy with us running wires through her beloved crawlspace. Josh coughed out a hushed laugh. She got bodies hidden down, there or something. Shit, I wouldn't be surprised. The door is dead bolted. Josh stopped laughing and his eyes widened. Really? I opened my mouth to speak when we heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. So, what does Mrs. Chevalier think? I asked Charles. He slumped down the stairs like he'd just received terrible news. I figured that meant the worst, but he looked at me glumly and said, she says it's all right. Oh. Okay. Great. I just need you to open that door for me then. Charles nodded and wallowed past me to the front door. I glanced over at Josh and gave a confused shrug. He stuck his tongue out and mimed like he was dying. I put on my coveralls that I wear into crawlspaces to keep clean, grabbed my flashlight, and joined Charles around the side of the house. All set, I said. Charles leaned down and unlocked the small door. He pulled it open and stood there jiggling his keys for a moment without saying a word and then turned and walked off. Thanks, Charles, I hollered after him. He didn't respond. I wondered if Eloise had spoiled his mood with a verbal lashing. I knelt and shined the light through the short opening. It looked like any other crawlspace, dark and dirty. I got on my hands and knees and crawled in. The dirt was cool against the palms of my hands. Damp. No light, of course, other than my flashlight. Tightly sealed crawlspaces are always more pleasant than the alternative, as there's less chance of animals getting in. However, I expected the occasional spider cricket to jump out at me and never did see one. In fact, I didn't see any animals or insects whatsoever. Yet, there was an odor, like something rotting. I wriggled over to about the spot I figured was below the closet and hollered for Josh. I'm sticking the rod down now, he answered. The rod, in this case, was a green glow rod we used to tape wires onto to fish them up walls. I waited a moment until I saw it poke through to my left. Got it, I said. All right. The rod began to twitch, hinting that Josh was taping on the wires. I heard a recurrent thump, moving across the floor overhead, Eloise making her way towards the closet. Behave yourself, Josh, I joked. I hear her. The rod stopped twitching. Good morning, Mrs. Chevalier, I heard Josh say, his voice more muffled now that he was standing. Eloise was slow to respond. Are you clean now? She asked. Excuse me. The scars on your arm. Are you clean now? There was a pause. It bothered me that she was asking my brother about his past drug use, and I know it must have bothered him as well. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't get upset with the old bag. Yes, ma'am, he said. I exhaled a sigh of relief. Good, she answered, and then there was a sudden loud bang. A moment of utter silence followed. Josh let out a pained groan and collapsed to the floor above me. Josh! I yelled. My heart was racing. I pounded on the floor. Josh! I quickly spun around and clambered on my hands and knees towards the sunlit entrance. I was slithering through the dirt as fast as I could. My back occasionally clipped against the overhead joists. I was nearly there when the sunlight was suddenly eclipsed. Kneeling at the doorway was Charles. I'm sorry, Charles said. He looked sincerely apologetic. I really thought she wanted an alarm. Charles. The door shut before I could reach it. There was a quick clomp of the deadbolt, sealing me away in the darkness of the crawlspace. I stared for a second in disbelief, then rotated and rolled onto my back. I reared back and kicked the door as hard as I could. It didn't budge. I did it again. Still no luck. I had wire strippers and a roll of electrical tape on me and nothing else. I'd left my tools in the house. My cell phone in the truck. Towards the other end of the crawlspace was the flashlight I'd left lying in the dirt, casting a beam of light against the brick wall. I crawled to it and listened for any sign that Josh was still alive. There were coming footsteps overhead, the rhythm I recognized as Charles. I can't keep doing this, Miss Eloise, he said. We're almost finished, she answered. Charles grunted like he was bending over. I listened as he hoisted Josh up and dragged him across the floor. Eloise tapped behind them. I grabbed the flashlight and crawled underneath, following the sound. Charles stopped a couple of times along the way to rest. I noticed that in the direction we were heading, there was a large hole in the dirt, something I hadn't seen before. Charles stopped almost above it. Going off memory, I figured he was in the living room. Eloise hobbled over and joined him. Next, I listened as he folded over the hefty antique rug in the center of the room. I shined the light around that same spot and saw a wooden hatch centered above the hole. I realized then that Charles was going to dump Josh through the hatch. I crept over to the hole and shined the light into it. That rotting putridity had become more intense, and it was obvious that it was coming from somewhere down in that hole. It was about a 10-foot drop into an open cavern-like area. I could see that it expanded further underground. There weren't any visible bodies or bones, which was surprising, all things considered. I leaned in a little further to get a better look and caught a quick glimpse of something pale dart past the edge of the beam. I gasped and stumbled backward. To me, it looked like the lower half of a pair of rapidly moving legs. I wondered if Eloise and Charles were holding captives down there. I glanced back overhead. The hole itself was more expansive than the hatch. I'd have to jump to get through. Once the hatch was open, and seeing as to how I had such little space to work with, there was no way I could kick off the ground with enough force to get to it. Once the hatch finally did creak open and there was a flood of fresh air and light, I discovered another reason I couldn't attempt an escape. Standing at the other side of the hatch, leaning on her cane and staring directly at me, was Eloise, revolver in hand. Is Josh alive? I asked, my main concern at that moment. Eloise remained silent. Josh. I yelled for him. Are you okay? Charles grunted, and Josh's limp upper half plopped down and dangled over the hole. My blood ran cold. My voice quivered as I called to him once more. He was shoved forward, and fell through the hatch and into the hole, colliding against the ground, with a heavy thud. I looked up at the cold-hearted Eloise, not a sign of remorse on her expressionless face, and muttered, "Why?" The hatch slammed shut. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe.